The Non-Aggression Pact was signed by Stalin from Russia and Hitler from Germany. This pact was signed which promised that Germany won't attack Russia or Russia won't attack Germany. After signing the Non-Aggression Pact, he promised Stalin half of Poland. Hitler's surprise attack happened on September 1st, 1939. Tanks and troops attacked Polish borders while aircraft and artillery was bombing Poland's capital, Warsaw. France and Great Britain declared war on Germany on September 3rd. The Germans practiced a new strategy on Poland called Blitzkrieg. This involved fast-moving airplanes and tanks. On September 17, Stalin sent his troops to take eastern half of Poland. Stalin then moved his troops to attack Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. All centuries. The French and British mobilized their armies after declaring war on Germany. They placed their troops along the Maginot Line and waited for the Germans to attack. Germany was also waiting for an attack. Eventually, no one attacked. On April 9, 1940, Hitler launched a surprise invasion of Denmark and Norway. In just a few hours, Denmark surrendered. Months after, Norway surrendered. In May of 1940, Hitler attacked and conquered the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. This was a part of a strategy Hitler used to be able to attack France. Hitler then sent large forces of tanks and troops to slice through the Ardennes. They reached the country's northern coast in 10 days. German troops joined each other in Belgium and were able to trap the Allied forces around the northern French city of Lille. The Allies retreated to the beaches of Dunkirk and were rescued by the British. The British sent over 850 ships to rescue the troops and were brought back to Britain. After Dunkirk, France began to crumble. By June 14, the Germans had taken over Paris. The French surrendered on June 22, 1940. The Germans took control of northern part of the country. Hitler's plans now were to focus on Britain. His plans was to knock out the Royal Air Force and land his troops on England's shores. In the summer of 1940, Germany's Air Force began bombing Britain. The Battle of Britain continued until May 10, 1941. Hitler caught up his army and focused on the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe. Germany's first objective was North Africa. Mussolini took his step on North Africa in September 1940. Within a week, Italian troops had pushed 60 miles inside Egypt, forcing British troops back. In December, Britain finally struck back. By February 1941, the British had taken over 500 miles across North Africa and took 130,000 Italian prisoners. Hitler had to send a tank to save his Axis partner. Hitler began planning an attack on the USSR in the summer of 1940. To prepare for his invasion, he persuaded Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary to join the Axis powers. In early April 1941, Hitler invaded and conquered Yugoslavia and Greece. By October 1940, the Americans cracked a code that was planning a surprise attack on the US. The code was from Japan. On the early morning of December 7, 1941, American sailors at Pearl Harbor heard a roar of explosives. The Japanese were attacking the United States. The Japanese sunk and damaged 19 ships, including 8 battleships, and more than 2,300 Americans were killed. Japan's next target was Midway Island, 1,500 miles west of Hawaii. On June 4th, American forces hid beyond the horizon and allowed Japanese to attack. American planes swapped in to attack the Japanese fleet. The strategy was successful. American pilots destroyed 332 Japanese planes, all 4 aircraft carriers, and 1 support ship. The Allies finally took the offensive side. Douglas MacArthur created a strategy named island hopping, which is to take over islands that were not well defended but were really close to Japan. At the dawn of August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal and the neighboring islands of Tulgi. In February 1943, the Battle of Guadalcanal ended, making the Japanese abandon their base they started building. On November 8th, an Allied force of more than 100,000 troops landed in Morocco and Algeria. Caught between Montgomery's and Eisenhower's armies, Rommel's Afrika Korps was finally crushed in May 1943. As Rommel suffered defeat in North Africa, German armies also met their match in the Soviet Union. The Battle of Stalingrad began on August 23, 1942. By early November 1942, Germans controlled 90% of the ruined city. Then another Russian winter set in. On November 19th, Soviet troops outside the city launched a counterattack. Closing in around Stalingrad, they trapped the Germans inside and cut off their supplies. On February 2nd, 1943, some 90,000 frozen bits half-starved German troops surrendered to the Soviets. As the Battle of Stalingrad raged, Stalin continued to urge the British and Americans to invade France. However, Roosevelt and Churchill decided to attack Italy first. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces landed on Sicily and captured it from Italian and German troops about a month later. On April 27, 1945, Italian resistance fighters ambushed some German trucks near the northern Italian city of Milan. Inside one of the trucks, they found Mussolini disguised as a German soldier. They shot him the next day and later hung his body in downtown Milan for all to see. By May 1944, the invasion force was ready. Thousands of planes, ships, tanks, and landing craft, and more than 3 million troops awaited the order to attack. The Germans knew that an attack was coming, but they didn't know where it would be launched. To keep Hitler guessing, the Allies set up a huge dummy army with its own headquarters and equipment. This make believe army appeared to be preparing to attack the French seaport of Calais. Coded name Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy was the largest land and sea attack in history. The invasion began on June 6, 1944, known as D-Day. Despite heavy loss, the Allies held the beachheads. Within a month of D-Day, more than 1 million additional troops had landed. Then, on July 25th, the Allies punched a hole in the German defense near St. Lo, and the United States Third Army, led by General George Patton, broke out. By September, they had liberated France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Then they set their sights on Germany. As Allied forces moved toward Germany from the west, the Soviet army was advancing toward Germany from the east. Hitler now faced a war on two fronts. On December 16, German tanks broke through weak American defense along a 75-mile front in the Ardennes. The push into Allies' line gave the campaign its name, the Battle of the Bulge. Although caught off guard, the Allies eventually pushed the Germans back. The Germans had little choice but to retreat, since there was no reinforcements available. After the Battle of the Bulge, the war in Europe rapidly drew to a close. In late March 1945, the Allies rolled across the Rhine River into Germany. On May 7, 1945, General Eisenhower accepted the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich from the German military. President Roosevelt, however, did not live to witness the long-awaited victory. He had died suddenly on April 12 as Allied armies were advancing towards Berlin. The United States and other Allied powers celebrated VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. After nearly 6 years of fighting, the war in Europe has ended. By the fall of 1944, the Allies were moving in on Japan. In October, Allied forces landed on the island of Liyi in the Philippines. In March 1945, after a month of bitter fighting and heavy losses, American Marines took Iwo Jima, an island 760 miles from Tokyo. On April 1st, U.S. troops moved onto the island of Okinawa, only about 350 miles from southern Japan. The Japanese put up a desperate fight. Nevertheless, on June 21st, one of the bloodiest land battles of the war ended. The Japanese lost over 100,000 troops and Americans 12,000. After Okinawa, the next stop for the Allies had to be Japan. President Truman's advisors had informed him that an invasion of the Japanese homeland might cost the Allies 500,000 lives. Truman had to make a decision whether to use a powerful new weapon called the atomic bomb or A-bomb. The first atomic bomb was exploded in a desert in New Mexico on July 16, 1945. The United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, a Japanese city of nearly 350,000 people. What? A second bomb was dropped in Nagasaki, a city of 270,000 people. More than 70,000 people were killed immediately. Radiation fallout from the two explosions killed many more. The Japanese surrendered to General Douglas MacArthur on September the 2nd. With Japan's surrender, the war has ended. Now countries face the task of rebuilding a war-torn world. By the end of the World War II, Europe lay in ruins. Close to 40 million Europeans had died, two-thirds of them civilians. A few of the great cities of Europe, Paris, Rome, and Brussels, remained largely undamaged by the war. However, many have suffered terrible destruction. The Battle of Britain left huge areas of London little more than blackened ruins. Warsaw, the capital of Poland, was almost completely destroyed. In 1939, Warsaw had a population of nearly 1.3 million. When Soviet soldiers entered the city in January 1945, only 153,000 people remained. A large number of people did not stay where they were, rather, they took to the roads. They displaced persons included the survivors of concentration camps, prisoners of war, and refugees who found themselves in the wrong country when post war treaties changed national borders. Yeah, that's it. While nations were struggling to recover politically and economically, they also tried to deal with the issue of war crimes. In 1945 and 1946, an international military tribunal representing 23 nations put Nazi war criminals on trials in Nuremberg, Germany. These trials were for Nazi leaders that participated in the camps and murdered millions of Jews. Adolf Hitler, the SS chief, Heinrich Himmler, and Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels have committed suicide long before the trials began. However, Hermann Göring, the commander of Luftwaffe, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, and other high-ranking Nazi leaders remained to face the charges. Hess was found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. Göring received the death sentence. 10 other Nazi leaders were hanged on October 16, 1945. The defeat suffered by Japan in World War II left the country in ruins. General Douglas MacArthur began a process of demilitarization or disabling the Japanese armed forces. MacArthur then turned his attention to democratization, the process of creating a government elected by the people. It went into effect on May 3, 1947.